وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So last week we were discussing the isti'adha. We're still on the isti'adha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. And we were going through the word for word meaning of the isti'adha. So we're going through the details of the different words that are found in the isti'adha, the word shaitan, the descriptions that Allah Azza wa Jal gives to shaitan generally in the Quran. And obviously in the isti'adha you have the word ar-rajim, the one who is outcast, the one who is accursed, these words that you find within the isti'adha. And then we kind of finished on started speaking about some of the fiqh issues or some of the rulings concerning the isti'adha in terms of what some of the scholars discussed. So inshallah, I think what we'll do is we'll recap where we kind of left off last week. So we kind of started on one of the first issues. I think we'll go over that again, and then inshallah we'll carry on from there. So the first issue that the scholars bring up with regards to isti'adha, one of the issues that they bring up, there's not necessarily an order to it, but one of the first issues that you'll come across in the books of tafsir also, which is why we're discussing it, but also in the books of fiqh, is when is the isti'adha said? When it comes to the recitation of the Quran, reading of the Quran, when is the isti'adha read? So some of the scholars took the verse of the Quran in the verse that is the basis of the isti'adha, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ, right? The verse of Surah Al-Nahl. If you're reading the Quran, or if you read the Quran, then seek refuge in Allah from shaitan the accursed. Some of the scholars took that verse literally, and they said that the فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ, right? If you are going to. They said that the fa means ta'qib, it means after. So basically the meaning of the verse is, once you've read the Quran, then seek refuge in Allah from shaitan the accursed. Right? Meaning once you've finished reading the Quran. And this is an opinion, as we said last week. It's mentioned amongst some of the scholars, like Muhammad ibn Sirin, rahimahullah, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, Dawood al-Zahiri, and there is even a narration of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, that this was the opinion that he followed, even though some of the scholars, the muhaqqiqeen, this word muhaqqiq means the verifiers, right? The scholars who came generations afterwards, and they would go through the statements of the companions and the scholars, and they would edit and verify them. Did they actually say what some of the scholars attributed to them, or was it just an error, right? Was it just a mistake? So those scholars who did this, they're known as the muhaqqiqeen. Some of them said that it's not actually the opinion of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, that it is gharib, it is peculiar to say that this was the opinion of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. Either way, even if it's not the opinion of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, there was some heavyweight scholars and heavyweight ulama behind this opinion, right? So for example, Muhammad ibn Sirin. Muhammad ibn Sirin rahimahullah is one of the scholars of the tabi'een. It's a famous name, a name that you've probably heard of many times, right? He's one of the students of the companions. And his main teacher from amongst the companions was Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu. Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu. And he met other companions and he heard from other companions as well. Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu used to love Ibn Sirin so much, and he had so much respect for him, for his scholarship, for his piety, for his character, that at the time of Anas ibn Malik, when he wrote his will, his final testament, he wrote within it that I want Ibn Sirin to wash my body when I pass away, and I want him to lead my janazah. Okay? And that's an honor, right? For any person to be asked to do that, for any of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's an honor. And as we know, Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu was one of the final companions to pass away, one of the latter companions in terms of their deaths. He was one of the last few remaining at that time. And it just so happened when Ibn Sirin, rahimahullah, when Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu passed away, Ibn Sirin was in prison. He was in prison. And he was in prison because he was in debt. He was in severe debt, and he was unable to pay back the debt. And in the Islamic law, if you're unable to pay back the debt, then the person that you owe that money to has the right to ask the judge to imprison you. Right? Imprison you. So Ibn Sirin was in that situation. He borrowed money, a great sum of money, and then he lost out for one reason or another. It's a whole long story that we don't need to go into. But the point is that he was unable to pay back his loan. And because he was unable to pay back his loan, the person whose right it was the money, the person that he borrowed it from, he said, I want him in prison, jail. So Ibn Sirin, rahimahullah, you can imagine, like this amazing, illustrious scholar of Islam, known for hadith, known for tafsir, known for fiqh, right? He's like one of the giants of that generation, and he's in prison. And whilst he was in prison, Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu passed away. So when they read the will of Anas ibn Malik and they read his final, like his wasiyah, which is his final requests, they read within it that he wanted Anas ibn Malik to come and to wash him and to shroud him and to lead his janazah. But there's a problem now, right? Because he's in prison. And so they had to go to the governor and request from him special permission that Anas ibn Malik ibn Sirin rahimahullah be allowed to come out and to wash and shroud the body, and the governor agreed to do so. Right? And what's really amazing is in one of those narrations of that story, Ibn Sirin rahimahullah, he said that I know which sin it was that landed me in jail. Right? The scholars of that era, their sins were so few and far between that sometimes when they had a calamity or a hardship strike them, they used to be able to pinpoint what it was that they did. And because of that, that's why Allah Azza wa Jal tested me in this way. Right? We'd struggle to do that, right? Because subhanAllah, we have so many sins. Which one equates to what? Allah knows best. But they were able to. He said that Ibn Sirin said, many years ago, I saw a man walking down the street and I said to him, Ya Muflis, you're bankrupt. Right? I called him destitute. Just call him bankrupt. And now Allah Azza wa Jal has tested me with that same thing. Right now he's bankrupt, he's destitute, he's impoverished, he's in debt, doesn't have any money to take himself out of that situation. But the point is that Ibn Sirin rahimahullah came and he led the janazah of Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu. So these were some of the great scholars of that era. They used to take this verse literally. So that if you read the Quran and once you finish the Quran, or your recitation of the Quran, your reading of the Quran, the passage that you're reading, then you say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Ar-Razi in his tafsir, Ibn Kathir, rahimahullah, in his tafsir, they say that the reason that they gave for this, right, the reasoning behind this, or the reasoning for their understanding of the verse in this way, was that they said it's because to stop yourself from feeling proud and arrogant after doing a good deed. So just as you do a good deed, as we know, you do a good deed, there's two elements to a good deed. One is doing the actual deed, and the second part of that deed is having it accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you can pray, we just prayed Salatul Maghrib now. And everyone that's standing in the rows and they prayed the Salah, they prayed it. Meaning the obligation was lifted from our shoulders. But did Allah Azza wa Jal accept our Salah or not? We don't know. Right? No one can have that cast iron guarantee that Allah Azza wa Jal accepted our deeds. What is one of the reasons why the deeds may not have been accepted, why they may have been rejected? Because a person has arrogance. Or they presume upon Allah that He accepted their deeds. Or because of some type of kibr, right? Some type of pride in their heart. Oh, I prayed and there's other people that didn't pray, right? Or I was praying and the guy next to me was fidgeting, so therefore I'm sure my prayer was better than his prayer. Whatever logic that shaitan brings into our minds, and look at how shaitan, and we're talking about isti'adah, shaitan even in good deeds will come and he'll plant a seed of doubt, or will make some thought that he plants within us that then causes us to sin, or to take what the good that we did and diminish it. So anyway, the point is here that those scholars said, therefore you remove that type of pride from you, right? That arrogance, that haughtiness from your heart, because you ask Allah Azza wa Jal to preserve your good deeds, right? That's the statement of Ibn Kathir rahimahullah and others, and that's what they said. The reasoning is behind that opinion. But the opinion of the majority of the scholars, right? The vast majority of the scholars of Islam is that the إِذَا in the verse, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ, when you read the Quran, means before you read the Quran. Right? And that's very common in the Arabic language. The word إِذَا, which literally translated means when. إِذَا can be used with different meanings depending on the context. One of those meanings is before. As you're about to embark upon, right? As you're about to begin, then read أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. And that's also very common in the Quran. Allah Azza wa Jal, for example, says in the verse in wudu, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu idha qumtum ila as-salah. O you who believe, when you stand for the prayer, then make wudu, right? Then Allah says, wash your hands and wash your face and so on and so forth. When you're going to stand for the prayer, then do so, right? Obviously, it doesn't mean after you finish the prayer, because the wudu has to be done before the prayer, right? So the meaning is either, meaning when you're about to stand for the prayer, when you're ready to stand for the prayer, make sure that you've done wudu, right? And Allah Azza wa Jalla says in another verse in the Quran, وَإِذَا قُلْتُمْ فَعْدِلُوا. when you speak, then be just. Obviously, it doesn't mean that after you've spoken, be just, right? Because that doesn't make any sense, right? So therefore, the meaning is what? Before you speak, make sure that you speak with justice, right? You speak in honesty, with integrity, truthfulness, and so on. And another third example of that is the verse of hijab, when it came to the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, radiyallahu anhun, وَإِذَا سَأَلْتُمُوهُنَّ مَتَاعًا فَاسْأَلُوهُنَّ مِنْ وَرَاءِ حِجَابٍ. When you want to seek something from them or ask them something, then ask them from behind a curtain, behind a veil, right? So when the companions used to come, or the students of the companions used to come, and they wanted to speak to Aisha radiallahu anha, one of the other mothers of the believers, out of respect for them, honoring them, they would speak to them behind a curtain, right? So Aisha radiallahu anha would teach, and she would have many companions, many men who would come, and she would narrate hadith to them, and she would teach them, and she was one of the most prolific narrators of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But she would have a curtain or a veil between her and those men because of this verse, right? And obviously the meaning of the verse is not that, once you've asked your question, then put the hijab down. Obviously the meaning is that before you ask the question, make sure that there is a curtain and a veil, right? And so that's how the majority of the scholars understood the isti'adah. And even logically it makes sense that when you're about to read the Quran, you want Allah Azza wa Jal to remove from you shaitan, right? And all of his, whisperings and temptations and so on and so forth, and all of that explanation that we've given over the last couple of weeks. So that was the opinion of the majority of the scholars of Islam, and that is the stronger opinion. Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. And it's even been reported among some scholars that they said you do both. Start off with the isti'adah, finish with the isti'adah, right? So you start off with A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajeem, and you finish with A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajeem. But the stronger opinion out of those is the opinion that says that you just do it at the beginning or before you're about to begin the recitation of the Quran. Is that clear? Any questions about that? Anyone want to ask? Yeah, Kaka?
You cited the A'udhu Billah, we recite that in the beginning of the surah, but we do the basmala as well. So if we are starting the surah from the middle, would we do? So
we're going to come on to that, right? So Kaka's asking, what if that's okay if it's at the beginning of the surah, what if you're midway, right? Then what do you start with and what don't you start with? We're going to, don't jump the gun. We're going to do that, inshallah. We're taking our time here, right? Like, why are you rushing? Yeah.
Shaykh, any scholars in particular that mentioned the position of reciting it before and after? Any notable scholars?
So the question is, who said you do both? And I remember reading it, but I don't remember who now. But it is mentioned that some of the scholars said just do both. And the reason why some of the scholars do that, one thing you'll find is when there's differences of opinion in terms of fiqh issues, one of the things that certain scholars like to do is try to join between the opinions, right? Try to reconcile. And it is like an approach of usul al-fiqh, that when you have differing opinions among scholars, if you can reconcile between them, then you should do so, right? Because you avoid conflict, you avoid contradiction. And so therefore some of the scholars said that, but it was only like one name or two names at most that said that. I don't remember exactly who. But you'll find them, for example, if you go back to Tabari's Tafsir, Ibn Kathir and so on, they go through this whole issue in a lot of detail. And Allah knows best. Any questions from sisters? Or yeah.
Which surah is the Bismillah mentioned?
The Bismillah?
Which surah was it?
We're not anywhere near the Bismillah.
The
Isti'adah. The Isti'adah is mentioned in a few surahs. It's mentioned in Surah Al-A'raf. It's mentioned in Surah Al-Nahl. I don't have the verse numbers. I'm not Dr. Zakir, like I can't do the whole. But we mentioned them before, inshallah. And they're in the notes, I think. So the notes, if you go onto the portal, you'll find them in the notes. 98, Surah Al-Nahl, verse 98. And Surah Al-A'raf is like 200 and something. Something like that, anyway. Yeah.
Is there anything from the Sunnah which is an example where the Prophet used the isti'adah before recitation or before anything? Is there anything like that?
Is there any example from the Sunnah in which the Prophet ﷺ used the isti'adah before recitation of the Quran? Yeah, there is, but we'll come on to that as well. So actually, yeah, we'll come on to that as well, inshallah.
So there's a question in mind: how do you balance between sinfully presuming upon Allah that He has accepted the deed and having husn dhan billah?
Okay, so how do you combine?
How do you balance
Or
between
how do you balance between not being arrogant and assuming that Allah has accepted your deed, and between having good thoughts of Allah and thinking good of Allah that He has accepted your deed, right? And that's why the scholars used to say that the believer is in between the two wings of hope and fear, right? That's what that means. You hope in Allah's mercy, that He accepts the good deeds, that if you're sincere and you did the action in the way that it should have been performed, that Allah Azza wa Jalla will accept the good deed. But at the same time, you're fearful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may reject that deed, because only Allah knows the situation or the state of our hearts and our piety at the time of that good deed. And that's where you have those like statements from Umar radiallahu anhu. Umar used to say radiallahu anhu that if I knew that Allah had only accepted one of my deeds, I would place all of my hope in it, right? And that's what he's saying, because he feared that Allah may have rejected some of those deeds, right? And you have statements like from Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, the companions, that they would rather be like a branch or a bark of a tree or something else than be a human, because the tree is not going to be held to account, right? There's no punishment for the tree. And so they used to say these statements are said because they were fearful, and these were obviously the greatest companions and the most knowledgeable and the most pious and the most righteous, but they had that fear within them, or that, you know, that kind of like sense that maybe Allah Azza wa Jal doesn't accept some of these deeds or hasn't accepted some of those deeds. And that was from their humbleness and humility, and not taking for granted what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to them in terms of favor and blessings. And that's important, right? So you're constantly in between those two things. You hope in Allah's reward, and if you did good, that Allah will reward you. But at the same time, you don't take it for granted, because if you take it for granted, you become lax, right? That's where shaitan comes in and says, oh no, but you've already prayed and it's already been accepted. Or, for example, that whole thing, right? I'll sin and then I'll do a good deed and it'll wipe the sin away. Right? That's a very common ploy of shaitan, right? Oh, it's okay, do the sin, but Allah tells us in the Quran, if you follow up a bad deed with a good deed, then the bad deed's wiped away, right? But what guarantee do you have that Allah accepts that good deed, right? That only works if Allah accepts the good deed. So therefore, when shaitan comes and he uses those types of whisperings, again, it's that type of pride, right? That type of haughtiness, right? Like shaitan had Iblis, that just because his origins were better, therefore, by necessity, he is better than everything else that Allah creates. And that's not how it works, right? And so therefore, those types of presumptions, those types of assumptions, they are dangerous. Okay, let's carry on, inshallah. The second issue with regards to the isti'adah is its ruling. Is it wajib or is it recommended? So for example, if you're going to start reading the Quran now, right? Just say right now, you want to start reading the Quran, Surah Baqarah, Ali Imran, any surah of the Quran. Must you recite the isti'adah first? Is it an obligation? And when we say obligation in terms of Islamic fiqh, what that means is that if you don't do it, what happens? You're sinful. Right? If you don't do it, you're going to be sinful. It's haram upon you to read the Quran without reading the isti'adah. That's what that means. Obligation. Or is it recommended? What does recommended mean? It means that you'll be rewarded if you do it, but if you don't do it, there's no sin. Right? And that's like generally in the salah, outside of the salah, whenever you're reading the Quran, must you say before you begin, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim? Right? Is it a must or not a must? So the scholars differ over this issue into two opinions. The first opinion is that it is wajib. It is an obligation. And those scholars who held this said that in the prayer or outside of the prayer, whenever you're going to read the Quran, you must always begin with the isti'adah. Right? So the first thing you start with is with what? A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Right? And this was the opinion of some of the noteworthy scholars of the past. From amongst them was Ata. Ata rahimahullah. Ata is one of the scholars of the Tabi'een, from the students of Abdullah ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, one of the great scholars of tafsir. He's a name that we're going to come across many, many times. Ata was a free slave. He was a slave that was emancipated. And he became from the closest students of Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, and studied with him, and he learned tafsir, and he became a great scholar. And he became so well known for his scholarship that he was known as the Mufti of Mecca. Right, in his time, obviously, in his time, the era of the Tabi'een, he was known as the Mufti of Mecca. To the extent that, like in Hajj, when everyone used to gather together, and you have like literally hundreds or thousands of scholars coming for Hajj annually, the Khalifa used to announce, no one should give fatwa in Hajj except Ata. Right? He's the Mufti of Mecca. So obviously, like, in Hajj, even now, every group has a Shaykh that they take, because there's so many issues in Hajj, right? People make mistakes, people don't know what's going on, people like miss out things and do things incorrectly and so on. And so you often find people giving fatwa. And because you can imagine in the time of the Tabi'een, you have literally thousands of amazing scholars, right? We're not just talking about anyone and everyone. We have some serious heavyweight names. And you can imagine, right, people giving different fatwas, different opinions, and just causing like confusion. So the Khalifa of that time, or the governor of Mecca, he made an edict. He gave like a ruling: no one should give fatwa in Hajj except for Ata. Right? And Ata is an amazing person. If you read his biography, he's amazing. There's a story of Ata, rahimahullah. He was once in the masjid praying, right? And the Khalifa, this is the Umayyad dynasty, right? The Khalifa took his two sons and he said, let's go to Ata because I want you to study with him. I want you to learn from him, right? And the Khulafa of that time, despite their weaknesses and the mistakes that they made, they had this love for Islam, generally speaking, and they had this thing about knowledge, right? They used to honor the scholars and so on, and they wanted their children to at least have a level of scholarship, a level of like understanding and knowing Islam. So he takes his two sons and he wants to go and learn from Ata. They go into the masjid and they find that Ata is praying. He's praying nafil prayers, right? It's in the middle of the morning, just praying nafil prayers. And the Khalifa, being the Khalifa, right, knew that if he had said to Ata, you come to my palace and teach my children, Ata would have said no, right? The student goes to the teacher doesn't go to the student. So he was trying to preempt this by going to the masjid himself with his sons. And he comes and Ata is praying. And he's praying his nafil prayer. And the nafil, like of the salaf was long, right? It's not like 2 minutes and you're done. He's literally like taking a long time. So the Khalifa said to his sons, wait here. Let me go and walk past him, right by his side. Let me walk in front of him so he can see in the corner of his eye that the Khalifa is here, and then he'll speed up his prayer, right? He'll quicken up, he'll hasten, he'll finish the prayer, and then he'll come and deal with us, right? Because we're standing at the back, he's at the front, he doesn't even know we're here. Okay, so the Khalifa goes and he walks towards the front of the masjid, so Ata can see in the corner of his eye, out of the corner of his eye, that the Khalifa is in the masjid waiting for him. And then he goes back. But Ata doesn't care, right? He's busy, he's praying, and he finishes his salah, and then he stands up and starts again, right? He just gets up and starts again. And then when he's finished praying, right, what he's going to normally pray, when he's finished with his nawafil and he's finished doing what he was going to do, then he turns around and he goes to the Khalifa and he gives him salams and he says, how can I help you? So he says that I brought my sons. The Khalifa says, I brought my sons because they have questions and they want to learn about certain issues and so on. So Ata sits with them and he teaches them what they wanted to know, answers their questions, deals with it. And then the Khalifa at the end, he says to him, oh Ata, tell me what I can do for you, right? You did this for us, tell me what I can do for you, right? And that was very common. The Khulafa, the governors and so on, they would honor people, right? They would honor poets, they would honor scholars. People came, what do you need, right? Can I help you financially? Is there a favor that I can do for you? And so on. So Ata said to the Khalifa, I feel embarrassed standing in the house of Allah that I should ask from other than Allah. I feel embarrassed standing in the house of Allah that I should ask from other than Allah. So the Khalifa is like a slap down, but the Khalifa is like, okay, no problem. And then he's like, let's walk outside. Walk with me, right? We're leaving, walk with me. So he makes Ata walk with him until he comes outside of the masjid. And then he says to Ata, now we're outside of the house of Allah, now ask. Right? Now we're outside the house of Allah, now ask me, tell me what you need. So Ata says to him, I feel embarrassed that I was just in the house of Allah and now I should ask from other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he turned around, went back in and he started praying. The Khalifa turned to his sons and he said, I've never been humiliated like this before in my life. Right? Never been humiliated like this before. Because this is how the scholars were, right? They had this izzah, they had this, the knowledge was more important to them than anything else. So the point is that Ata is like a heavyweight name, right? So he was of this opinion, and by the way, Ata has both opinions, right? So that doesn't really help. But he has both opinions, that the isti'adah is obligatory and that it's recommended. He has both narrations are mentioned from Ata, rahimahullah. But the opinion that it is wajib is also mentioned from the Zahiri school of thought or school of law. Ibn Hazm rahimahullah in his book Al-Muhalla says that it is also wajib. And the reason why they say it's wajib, their proof is that they're taking the apparent meaning of the verse, right? Allah says that that when you're about to read the Quran, make the isti'adah, right? Say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. And that's a command, right? And when Allah commands something, what does that mean? It means it's obligatory, right? Generally speaking, right? When Allah commands something in the Quran, when Allah says pray, doesn't mean if you want to pray, pray, right? It means pray, you have to pray, right? Give zakah means you have to give zakah, right? Make hajj means you have to make hajj. So the obligatory order, the command of Allah Azza wa Jal denotes an obligation. So that's the opinion of those scholars. The vast majority of the scholars of Islam, though, from amongst the companions and after the companions, were of the opinion that it is mustahab, it is recommended. So, based on that second opinion, if you were to read the Quran without making isti'adah, so you're just sitting here now and you say Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, right? Or in the middle of the surah, you just start off, right? يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ. Any verse of the Quran, you can just start to read it without isti'adah and you're not sinful. It's perfectly allowed. However, they said that it is better, more rewarding, closer to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that you read the isti'adah before you start recitation. Right? And this is the opinion that the Qurra have. Right? The Qurra are the scholars of the Quran recitation. Right? They have this opinion that you should, it is highly recommended that you always begin with the isti'adah. Whether at the beginning of the surah or whether in the middle of the surah. You always begin with the isti'adah. And this was the opinion that it is recommended. It's the opinion of companions like Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, Abu Hurairah, the opinion of many of the tabi'een. Ata again has this opinion, Al-Hasan al-Basri, Ibn Sirin, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, Al-Awza'i, Al-Thawri, rahimahumullah. And it is the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Ahmad, and the majority of the Shafi'iyah, right? Imam Shafi'i and his followers, the scholars of his madhab. So the vast majority of the scholars of Islam hold this opinion, right? They hold this opinion. One name that isn't mentioned here amongst the four Imams is whose name? Imam Malik, right? And there's a reason for that, but we'll discuss that in a short while. So they said that it is recommended, mustahab. Why is it mustahab? So why did they take that verse of the Quran and not take it literally? Allah Azza wa Jalla says, when you read the Quran, say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, and that's a command. Why did they say that command isn't obligatory but it is recommended?
Is it because it comes under the issue of adab and so therefore they will say it's slightly weakened into...
Okay, because it's an issue of etiquette. Okay, but you still have the verse, right? So in order for the verse not to be taken literally as a command that denotes obligation, what do you need? You need another evidence, right? You need a hadith, you need something else to show you that actually it's not like that, right? So for example, let me give you an example. Allah Azza wa Jalla in the Quran, when He speaks about ihram, in the state of ihram, one of the things that you can't do is hunt, right? Is hunt, right? So you can't hunt. You can't hunt game. Then Allah Azza wa Jalla says, وَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمْ فَاصْطَادُوا. But when you come out of the state of ihram, then go and hunt. And it's a command. Right? Go and hunt. And it's a command. So all of you that have done Umrah and Hajj and so on, when you came out of ihram, how many of you were hunting? Right? No one goes hunting. Why? So it's a command from Allah, go and hunt, but then none of us went and hunt. Right? No one goes hunting. How do you take that verse that apparently seems to say that it's obligatory to go and hunt and say actually it doesn't mean go and hunt, it means something else? It's taken, no, but where's it taken from? How do we make that leap? We make that leap because of another evidence, right? And in this case the evidence would be the hadith, right? The Prophet ﷺ never hunted after coming out of the state of ihram. Right? He made umrah, he made hajj, didn't go and hunt. Right? The companions didn't go and hunt. Which shows what then? It shows that that verse isn't literal, but what it means is that now you're out of the state of ihram, it's allowed for you to go hunting again. And from the eloquence of the Arabic language, Allah said it in a command form to show you that now it's halal, right? To that extent, right? It's like from the eloquence of the Arabic language. So therefore and that's why it's so important when you come and study like these issues, never take a verse or a hadith in isolation, right? You have to bring everything together and you have to take a comprehensive overview. So likewise the same here, right? So when the Prophet ﷺ, often when he would say or read the Quran or write down verses of the Quran or when he was giving a khutbah, or when he would be speaking and he would say read the Quran, there are many instances in the Sunnah where he wouldn't begin with isti'adah. Wouldn't say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Sometimes he would say Bismillah if it was the beginning of the surah, or sometimes he would just read the verse. And he wouldn't say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. And you will find that many. If you go to any hadith book and you look at the way the Prophet ﷺ used to mention verses of the Quran, you will find this very common. Okay? And so therefore that shows, and this is why the vast majority of the scholars hold this opinion, because the general sunnah shows that the Prophet ﷺ never used to make the isti'adah each and every single time. So therefore it is recommended. Right? And some of the scholars, the way that they reconcile between those two is that they said if it's the odd verse, right, you're just the odd verse that you're reading, you don't have to make the isti'adah. But if you're not going to sit down and read the Quran for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, right, you're going to do some recitation of the Quran, then it's recommended for you to make the isti'adah. But if I'm like, for example, giving a lecture here, and I'm going to read, a verse because it's part of the lesson, or it's part of, I don't have to say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim each and every single time. Okay? And so that's how like the scholars somewhat reconcile between the two. And this is, like some of the scholars, because there's only like 1 or 2 names in the history of Islamic scholarship that said that it is wajib to make the isti'adah, some of the scholars said that there is ijma' that it is mustahab. Ijma' means consensus. But ijma' means that the scholars have unanimously agreed on a certain position. And it is one of the strongest evidences in Islam. Because it means that all of the Muslims have agreed on a point. If the Muslims, all of the scholars, rather not every Muslim, but all of the scholars agree on a single point, it means that it is one of the strongest evidences in our religion. So Imam al-Tabari rahimahullah, in his tafsir, he said that there is ijma' that it is mustahab. Ijma' consensus of the scholars that the isti'adah, saying A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, is recommended. Right? And likewise, Imam al-Sarakhsi, who is one of the great scholars of the Hanafi madhab, he said after mentioning that Ata rahimahullah said that it is wajib, obligatory, he said this goes against the ijma' of the Salaf. He said that his opinion goes against the ijma' of the Salaf, and Ata, as we said, has both opinions narrated from him. Right? So it's as if Imam al-Sarakhsi said that his other opinion shouldn't be counted. Al-Imam ibn Atiyah rahimahullah in his tafsir, so tafsir ibn Atiyah is another famous classical work of tafsir, he also said that there is ijma'. Right? And Ibn Kathir rahimahullah didn't say that there was ijma', but he said that the vast majority of scholars said that it is mustahab. Right? It is recommended that you make the isti'adah, but it is not something which you have to do. It's not an obligation. Either way though, it's something that you should do. Right? So especially if you're going to sit down and read some Quran, it is something that you should do and you should be in the habit of doing. And if you have children and they're going to be reading the Quran, it's something that you should get them into the habit of doing. Irrespective of the fact that whether it's sinful or not sinful, just because of the blessing of that wording, right? So we've spent this is the 3rd week and we're doing isti'adah. And we've spoken so much about the meaning and its importance and how much of a pivotal role it should play within our lives. So therefore, it's something that we should be accustomed to doing, right? It's something that we want our children to be accustomed to doing, that when they're reading the Quran, they're making this isti'adah. And inshallah, if we get there, we're going to speak about the different instances in which the Prophet ﷺ recommended seeking refuge in Allah, right? Seeking Allah's protection from shaitan and so on. And so therefore that's something also which I think is important. So that brings us on to another issue, and that issue is... Yeah. Okay, any questions? Okay, fine, we'll do questions.
Which should you say the isti'adah when you recite Surah Tawbah?
Okay, so is the isti'adah in Surah At-Tawbah? So this is kind of linked to the Basmala issue, right? So when you say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim at the beginning of every surah, the exception to that is Surah At-Tawbah, right? Also known as Surah Bara. But yes, the isti'adah is made. So the isti'adah is always made. So whether it's at the beginning of a surah, midway of a surah. So if you're going to start off by reading Surah At-Tawbah, you would say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bara'atun min Allahi wa rasul. Right? And you start off. Right? And that's the opinion of the scholars, and it's the opinion of the Qurra. Right? When I say Qurra, you guys know what I mean by Qurra? Right? I don't mean when I say reciters, I don't mean like Ajami and Shatri and these guys. What I'm talking about is the classical scholars who are the imam, the leaders or the imams of Quran, right? And qira'at, and how its recitation should be done. And they took that recitation from the companions of the Prophet. Some obviously took it from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And they are the ones that we attribute our rules of tajweed to, right? So when we say we're reading in Warsh, or we're reading on Hafs, or we're reading, in any qira'ah, this is what we're talking. We're talking about the Qurra, right? Imam al-Shatibi, Abu Amr al-Dani that we mentioned last week, and before them, right? They're later scholars of qira'at, but the earliest scholars, right? Going all the way back to the likes of the tabi'in and the teachers from amongst the companions. That's what we mean by when we say Qur'an, right? In our modern day language, Qur'an means any recite of the Qur'an, right? Everyone's a qari, right? You go to your masjid and the imam's a qari, and everyone learns a qari, lots of qaris now. But when we're speaking in Quranic sciences, and we're speaking about tafsir, and we say Qur'an, we're talking about the imams, right? We're talking about the imams that lived well over 1,000 years ago, and how they would recite the Qur'an. And that's why when you're reading the Qur'an to a shaykh who gives you an ijazah, right, which is the chain of narration from you all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ, you will read in the Qur'an according to that level and that standard of qira'ah, right? So it's something which is preserved from generation to generation. So they were of the opinion that you should read the isti'adah for Surah Al-Tawbah, and likewise at the beginning or at the end or in the middle of any recitation, the isti'adah is always done. As opposed to the basmala, right? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which we'll come on to probably next week. But Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is only at the beginning of the surah. Right? It's only at the beginning of the surah. Can you read it midway? Yes, you can read it midway. I don't think that it's haram to read it midway, but it's not generally the thing that is done, right? Because Allah Azza wa Jalla doesn't say you read the basmala, right? He says read the isti'adah. And so therefore the recitation, you proceed it with the isti'adah and not necessarily the basmala unless it's the beginning of the surah. Any other questions?
Says one of mine, is it required to read the isti'adah when you're reading the translation?
Is it required to read the isti'adah when you're reading the translation? No. Why? Because the translation isn't the Quran. The translation of the meanings of the Quran is not the Quran. Right? It's like reading an Islamic book, right? If you pick up Fath al-Bari, Sahih al-Bukhari, Tafsir ibn Kathir, it's not the Quran. You don't have to start by saying A'udhu billahi min shaitan rajim. You can if you want to, but it's not something which you have to do. Okay. Can we move on? Okay. Any questions? Okay. So the next issue is in Salah. If we're reading A'udhu billahi min shaitan rajim before recitation, right? So we're of this opinion that it's now recommended. Before you start, you say A'udhu billahi min shaitan rajim. In the Salah, is that done in every single rak'ah or only once at the beginning of the Salah? So for example, we read Salat al-Maghrib, right? And we're going to read Salat al-Isha, inshaAllah. So when you say Allahu Akbar, right, at the beginning of the Salah, and you start with your dua, right? Allahumma ba'id bayni wa bayna khataya, or subhanak Allahumma bihamdik, whichever dua that you're beginning with. And then you say, A'udhu billahi min shaitan ar-rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Right? And then you carry on with Surah Fatiha, and then you read another surah, and then you go into ruku', out of ruku', sajda, you guys know, you follow, right? You go through the first rak'ah, and then you stand up to the second rak'ah. What do you start with? That's the question. Right, that's the mas'ala. Do you start with A'udhu billahi min shaitan ar-rajim again, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah, or do you just say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin? Right? So this is another issue with regards to the isti'adah. The vast majority of the scholars of Islam are of the opinion that in the salah, your recitation of the Quran is one. It's all one recitation. Which therefore means, what do you do with the isti'adah? You only make the isti'adah once. Right? So that's the opinion of the majority of the scholars. Ata, Al-Hasan al-Basri, Imam al-Nakha'i, Al-Thawri, Ibn Sirin, Tawus, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam al-Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad, on one of his narrations from Imam Ahmad, rahimahumullah, all of them said that you just say A'udhu billahi min shaitan ar-rajim at the beginning of the salah. And you don't need to repeat it. So the second rak'ah, you don't have to say it again. The third rak'ah, you don't have to say it again. If there's a fourth rak'ah, you don't have to say it again. Once is enough for the whole salah. And they base that on two things. Number one, they said that the salah is all one dhikr. Right? So even when you're not reading Quran, what are you doing? You're making dhikr of Allah, right? You're saying Allahu Akbar, you're saying Subhana Rabbil Azim, you're saying Subhana Rabbil A'la, you're making dua to Allah, it is dhikr. The isti'adha, they said, is when you break the recitation of the Quran with worldly issues. Right? So if you're reading the Quran and then you get up to go to the bathroom, Azzakumullah, you go and have a meal, you go out with your friends, you get a phone call and you're on there for half an hour, you're on your emails and so on, and then you come back to the Quran, now you begin with the isti'adha again. Because you broke it up with something else, right? Not remembering Allah. You did something else. But if the whole thing is just remembrance of Allah, you're just making dhikr, you're reading Quran, you're making dua, whatever else it is, and then you come back to Quran, you don't have to make the isti'adha again. Right? That's the first reasoning that they gave. The second reasoning, which is stronger, is based on a hadith. The hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. And he said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he would stand up for the second rak'ah in the salah, he wouldn't pause, but he would begin recitation. He wouldn't pause. Meaning what? That he wouldn't stay silent. Right? So you know when you first start salah, the Imam says Allahu Akbar, he pauses. Right? There's a pause because he's making the opening dua and everyone else is making the opening dua. That's a pause. So in the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, this hadith is in Sahih Muslim. Hadith in Sahih Muslim. He said that when he would stand up for the second rak'ah, he wouldn't pause, but he would begin recitation immediately. And so they use that as an evidence, the vast majority of the scholars, to show that there's no isti'adha. Right? The Prophet wouldn't stay silent and he wouldn't say the isti'adha out loud. Right? So therefore he wouldn't read the isti'adha and he would just continue and they would carry on in that way. And this was the opinion of Imam Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah and others from amongst the scholars. Many scholars had this opinion. And then some of the scholars, the second opinion is obviously the opposite, which is that you read the isti'adha at the beginning of every rak'ah. So every rak'ah that you stand up in, the first thing that you're going to start with is what? A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, according to that second opinion. And this was the opinion of Al-Imam al-Nakha'i and Ibn Sirin, and it is one of the opinions in the Shafi'i madhab. It is one of the opinions of the Shafi'i madhab. And Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah said that in our madhab, it is recommended that you say the isti'adha in every single rak'ah. Every single rak'ah. And this is the opinion that Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah favored. Ibn Hazm rahimahullah also said this. Again, one of the names that we haven't mentioned is Imam Malik. Imam Malik has an interesting take on the isti'adha in salah. Imam Malik rahimahullah says that the isti'adha is only for the nafl salahs. Only in nafl salah, in optional prayer, or in qiyamul layl, you say a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. But in your obligatory salahs, Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, any obligatory salah, the 5 daily prayers, you don't say the isti'adha. Right? Because he said the isti'adha isn't from the Quran. And we covered that already, right? All the scholars agree that the isti'adha isn't from the Quran. Right? The verse, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, or that wording, isn't a verse of the Quran. The command to read it, yes, is in the Quran, but that wording, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, is not a verse of the Quran. So it's as if Imam Malik rahimahullah said that it's not something that you should do in the obligatory prayers. Why does he allow it in the optional prayers then? Why does he allow it in the optional prayers?
Because he did say they were the lesser type way.
Yeah, so that's one reason, because obviously the optional prayer is slightly more laxed, right, in terms of its rulings. It's slightly more laxed, right? So, you know, the Prophet ﷺ would ride and he would read the optional salah, right? He would ride on his animal beast and he would read optional salah. But when it came to obligatory prayers, he would get down and he would stop and he would stand and he would pray. So it's a bit more easier going, right? And so as if Imam Malik rahimahullah said, okay, you know, the nafil prayers and qiyamul layl, because there's actually explicit hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said the isti'adha, and it's mentioned in the hadith, in the wording, that he said, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim in qiyamul layl, right? In the hadith of Abu Sa'id radiallahu anhu, and we mentioned that last week, I think, or the week before. And so therefore, based on that, he said it's something that you do in qiyamul layl, or it's something that you do in the optional prayers, and it's not something which you do in the obligatory prayers. And that's why in the opinions that we've mentioned, Imam Malik's name doesn't come up. Right? Imam Malik doesn't have a view because Aslan he doesn't think that it's something that you should be doing anyway. Right? And so therefore his opinion isn't something which is mentioned. And then we come on to a related issue, and that is, do you read the isti'adha out loud or not? Right? Is it said out loud or is it said silently. The isti'adha. So in the salah, when you're about to pray, do you say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim out loud? And obviously this is like in congregational prayer, right? Does the imam say it out loud or does he say it silently? The vast majority of the scholars are of the opinion that it's said silently, right? And this is the opinion of the four khulafa, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, Abdullah bin Umar, Ibn Mas'ud, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Ahmad, one of the opinions in the Shafi'i madhab, and Imam Malik when he says that it is allowed to do it in the optional prayers and so on. All of them say that it's something that you should do silently. Something that you should do silently. And then other scholars said, no, it's something that you do out loud. So just as, like some of the scholars, and we'll come on to this, but some of the scholars are of the opinion that you say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud, right? In the salah, and you've probably come across this when you're praying behind some imams. Even for Fatiha, they will say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud, and then they will start with Surah Fatiha, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, right? And we'll come on to that issue later on. But some of the scholars were of the opinion that you do the same with the isti'adha. So you'll say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Right? You say out loud. And this is said that it is the opinion of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, and it's also one of the opinions in the Shafi'i madhab. Right? Imam al-Shafi'i in his book Al-Umm, right, which is the book that he wrote himself, rahimahullah, he mentions this as a narration from Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. And he said, Imam al-Shafi'i commenting on this, he said that you make the isti'adha out loud, and if you do it silently, then there's no problem. Right? So it's allowed to do both, but he said that it's something that you should do out loud. And that's why the Shafi'i madhab has a third opinion, and that is that you have a choice. You can do it out loud, or you can say it silently. Right? And you have the choice between the two. Ibn Abi Layla, rahimahullah, was also one of the great scholars of the past. He said that both of them are good. Saying it out loud sometimes and saying it quietly sometimes, both of them are allowed. But the vast majority of the scholars said that it's something that you should say silently, and that is a stronger opinion simply because that is what the Prophet ﷺ used to do. Right? Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah said that the only time you would do it out loud is to teach someone. So if you're leading the salah and you're with your children and you want to teach them what they should recite in salah, okay, you can do it out loud, right? Or if you have some new Muslims and you're teaching them how to pray and you're praying, you're leading them in salah, you can do it out loud to teach them. But the vast majority of the times it is something which you should do silently, and that is the opinion of the vast majority of the scholars, and it's also the opinion of the Qur'an. Right? The opinion of the Qur'an is that you make the isti'adha silently. That's in the salah. What about outside the salah? What about outside the salah?
Silently.
No. Outside the salah, they say you do it out loud. Right? So if you're reading the Qur'an, you're just sitting down in the masjid at home and you want to read Surah Kahf, you want to read whatever you're going to read, then you say out loud. Right? The isti'adha and the basmala. Say it out loud and then you start. Right? And that's the preferred opinion amongst the Qur'an. Even though there is some difference of opinion, but it's the preferred opinion amongst the Qur'an, and Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. Any questions on that issue? If the sisters have questions, please call out as well. Okay.
Someone says, do you recite it before new surah in the first regard, according to the tradition of reciting in every rak'ah?
No, so the isti'adha, the question is, do you recite it before every surah or just at the beginning? Right? It's just at the beginning. So just with Fatiha. Once you've done it once, then you don't need to do it again. Even in the opinion that says that you recite it in every rak'ah, it's only at the beginning of the rak'ah, right? Because the rest of it's all Qur'an. So whether you're reading Fatiha then another surah, you're just moving from one surah to another, and that's all Qur'an. Right? There's a question at the back, yeah? Salam to that.
You said you have to recite it out loud when you're reading the Quran outside Salah. Do you have to recite it out loud? Can you just...
No, you don't have to recite it out loud. Okay, so the question is, the isti'adha, do you have to read it aloud? Like, is it a must, or can you read it silently? You can read it silently if you want, right, outside of the salah. And by the way, when we say out loud, we don't mean you have to shout it out loud, right? Not like, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir. The whole world doesn't need to know. What it means is that you're reading it in an audible voice to yourself. Might say if you might suggest that so that you can hear it. That's what they mean, right? Not necessarily that it's really loud. Any questions? Yeah.
In regards to the hadith from Abu Hurairah and Sahih Muslim and the fact that the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't pause in the second rak'ah, how would people in the salah know whether or not the Prophet ﷺ had read it in the first rak'ah? And also, according to Imam Malik's opinion, the isti'adha is not in the Quran, but the durood isn't in the Quran either, so how do we draw the conclusions?
Okay, do that one more time, because that just confused me, man.
So the first one is in the hadith from Abu Hurairah and Sahih Muslim and the fact that the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't pause in the second rak'ah.
Yeah.
How would people in Salah know whether or not the Prophet ﷺ has read it in the first rak'ah?
So in the hadith of Abu Hurairah, where the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't pause in the second rak'ah, how would they know that he read it in the first rak'ah? I mean, it's mentioned, this hadith that mentioned that how the Prophet ﷺ used to begin his salah, right? So he would read the dua al-istiftah, the opening dua, and then he would say, A'udhu billahi min shaitan ar-rajim, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and carry on, right? That's mentioned in other hadith, right? So the point of this hadith, the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, Sahih Muslim, is that in the second rak'ah he wouldn't pause like that as he did in the first. To show that you don't make that repetition, right? You don't have to repeat that again, but you just move on, right? That's why I understood from the question. I don't know, I may have misunderstood. And what was the second question?
In regards to Imam Malik's opinion regarding the isti'adha not being in the Quran, the durood isn't in the Quran either, so how do we marry between the two?
That's completely unrelated. So the question is, Imam Malik says that the isti'adha is in the Quran, so therefore you don't have to read it, but neither is the durood. So how do you marry between the two? So we take the salah from the Prophet ﷺ, right? So the Prophet ﷺ used to, we know what he recited in every single part of the salah, right? The companions related that to us. And so therefore, based on that, that's how you should pray. So this is the opinion of Imam Malik rahimahullah, and he has his opinion, and as we said, it's not the stronger opinion. The stronger opinion is that you do make the isti'adha. Whether it's the obligatory salah, or whether it's the optional salah, you make the isti'adha, because that's the general, right? The general nusus, right? The general texts from the Quran and the Sunnah, that's what they show, that you make the isti'adha. So as for Imam Malik rahimahullah, that's like the opinion that he favored rahimahullah. And as we said before, right, these are major scholars, even though there may only be one or two or three of them that held that opinion, that's something which they consider to be strong, right? And it's something which they consider to be the correct opinion, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. And as the Prophet ﷺ said to us, when a scholar makes ijtihad and he has an opinion based upon study, if he's correct, Allah will give him 2 rewards, and if he's incorrect, Allah will give him 1 reward, right? Because he still has the reward of the efforts that he put in. Not everyone's perfect, right? People didn't understand certain hadith, or certain hadith didn't come across to them, or maybe they thought certain hadith were weak or authentic, whatever it may be. They had their reasoning for the opinions that they formed, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. Right? Okay. So now we're going to move on to the places in which the isti'adha is recommended, right? Where you should read the isti'adha. And I mentioned this in summary form in the class notes. By the way, how many of you guys are on the portal? Right? Is everyone here on the portal? Right? Quranicprogression.org. Some of you guys are looking blank, like what's here on the back? Okay. So as we've said, like over the last couple of weeks, this class is also being streamed online. But even if you're attending physically, I would recommend that you sign up to the portal. Time to go home. Manish. So you sign up to the portal Quranicprogression.org, and the benefit of that is, even if you're attending the lessons live, you have the recordings available, right? So I think, are they available in audio podcast?
They will be, inshallah.
They will be, inshallah. That's like, is that a real inshallah? Is that one of those? Okay. So a podcast, so you can like just listen to the audios, and the videos. So like these lectures, you can go rewind them and rewatch them and so on. Number 3, the class notes. So for the isti'adha, there's class notes, right? And it's not as detailed obviously as what we're going through, but it gives you like the structure of what we're going to be going through. And we're going to do that inshallah throughout the whole tafsir of the Quran, right? And so that's just something for you to follow, and then you can add onto that and you can go into and so on. And it's all in one place, right? It's just there for you. And the best thing is it's free. Right? We're not charging you anything. You don't have to pay, right? Which is, I know that's why most of you didn't sign up yet, because you're thinking they're going to charge us like a monthly subscription or something. So, no, it's free, alhamdulillah. So you can go and, it's something which I would recommend that you do anyway, because there will be also times when I'm not going to be in the country, right? When I'll be traveling, but this class will still take place online. So I'll be broadcasting live from wherever I am. And obviously in those weeks you don't need to come to the masjid, but you can still, come to the masjid to pray obviously. Or maybe you can show them on the screen here, depending. But anyway, the point is that these classes inshallah will never be cancelled, right? Until we finish the first academic year up until Ramadan next year, even if I'm not in the country or something else happens, whatever it may be, these classes will still inshallah be streamed. So I would highly recommend QuranicProgression.org. The portal's still like under development, so it's something which I would be patient inshallah, but it's something which in the next few weeks will be up to scratch. And then you can also see basically so these people online were posting their questions and their comments and so on. You can see all of that as well, inshallah ta'ala. The other thing, before I forget, is I have an Al-Maghrib course coming up on the 12th to the 14th. Let me put this up here. The 12th or the 14th of October. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this is about the Quran as well. It's called Lost in Translation. Where is it, Papa? University of Birmingham. Okay. University of Birmingham, inshallah, 12th to the 14th of October. And that's on Tadabbur. It's on how to contemplate the Quran. So we're doing tafsir. Tafsir is, what did Allah say? What did the Prophet ﷺ say? What did the companions say? What did the scholars of tafsir say? Tadabbur is a very personal thing. It's contemplation. How do you take all of that information that you're learning and use it in a way that increases your iman? Right? It brings you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it's a completely different type of Quranic study. And inshallah we'll go through over a weekend. It's a weekend course, inshallah. If you go to almaghrib.org, you'll get all of the details. But it's something which I would highly recommend, not because it's my course or anything like that, because it's a very neglected topic. If you ask the vast majority of Muslims across the world, what's tadabbur or how do you contemplate the Quran, they won't be able to tell you. Even though Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran tells us, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنِ, why don't they contemplate the Quran? Right? And the sad thing is, most of us don't even know what contemplation is. How do you even begin to contemplate the Quran? And the difference between tafsir and contemplation is tafsir is something that you do with a scholar. Right? You come to a class, you learn with someone that studied, you go through the classical works of tafsir. Contemplation is something that Allah says every Muslim should do. Why don't they contemplate the Quran? So you don't need to be a scholar. The whole point is that it's personal, right? You're not teaching this to anyone, right? You're not writing a book about this or giving a lecture on this or teaching a course on this like I am. The point is that this is personally for you, for your family, for your children, right? This is for you and your group of people, and it's to learn how to contemplate the Quran. So I just wanted to mention that as well. Okay, so the isti'adha. Where do we make the isti'adha? So we've done already a couple, so we're just gonna whiz through a couple of these. The first one is obviously recitation of the Quran, right? So Allah Azza wa Jal, as we've mentioned numerous times, tells us to make the isti'adha before we read the Quran. Number two is when shaitan tempts you, when shaitan whispers to you, right? When shaitan incites you to do something, Allah Azza wa Jal says, make the isti'adha. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِمَّا يَنزَغَنَّكَ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ نَزْغٌ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ. When shaitan comes and he prods you, he incites you, he whispers to you, then seek refuge in Allah. And this verse is in Surah Al-A'raf, verse number 200. Right? And similar to it is the verses in Surah Al-Mu'minun, verse number 97, 98. وَقُلْ رَبِّ أَعُوذُ بِكَ مِنْ هَمَزَاتِ الشَّيَاطِينِ وَأَعُوذُ بِكَ رَبِّ أَن يَحْضُرُونَ. O Allah, I seek refuge in you from the presence or from the incitement of the shayateen, right? From their whisperings. And I seek refuge in you, O Allah, that they should be present, that they should come and draw close to me, right? And so this is also part of the isti'adha. And then you have a verse in Surah Al-A'raf, verse number 201, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا إِذَا مَسَّهُمْ طَائِفٌ مِّنَ الشَّيْطَانِ تَذَكَّرُوا فَإِذَا هُمْ مُبْصِرُونَ. Those who have piety, those who have taqwa, when shaitan incites them, whispers to them, they remember Allah and then they, mashallah. That's explanation of what I'm saying. تَذَكَّرُوا فَإِذَا هُمْ مُبْصِرُونَ, right? They are reminded of Allah and then they see the errors of their ways. Right? They see the errors of their ways. So Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying, when shaitan comes and he whispers to you, incites you to do some sin, plants an evil thought into you, one of the easiest and greatest and most beneficial ways of removing that doubt, that seed of whisper, is just to say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Right? And now inshallah when you say it, you'll know what it means. You know the importance of that statement, the gravity of that statement, you know what it means to seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is that important, right? And that's why you don't have this thing, right? It's become like fairly common in amongst us now, where people have this, like in Arabic they call it waswasa, right? Some people just constantly in doubt, right? They constantly have shaitan coming and whispering to them. And they're always constantly in doubt in wudu, in salah and so on. You don't get this amongst the companions because they understood the meaning of the isti'adha and its power. And so when shaitan would come, they would say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, it was enough. The problem is now is that we say it so many times, but it doesn't have any benefit, right? It doesn't make an impact upon us because we don't really know what it means, right? We've lost touch with these adhkar and these du'as and so on and so forth. So that's the second time. So the first time is the Quran, right? Recitation of the Quran. The second time is when shaitan whispers to you or he wants you to do something, sin or whatever. Then you say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Are we stopping for the adhan? Yeah. Okay, sure. Let's just, we'll break for the adhan. Assalamu alaikum. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد. We have about 10 minutes I think to Salah, so I don't know if should we carry on or does anyone have any questions? We don't have a Q&A today. I think we should just carry on. Right. Any sisters have any questions? You have to speak up, sorry, I can't. Yeah. So the question is like, if we're reading isti'adha out loud to teach someone, I think the question was, what's the general ruling of doing that?
So teaching salah to a toddler or someone young, so you can't really only be silent.
Yeah. So when it comes to teaching salah, okay, so there's two things. Number one is you teach the salah outside of the salah, right? So if you're teaching someone to pray, but it's not the prayer time, so you're sitting down with them and teaching them what to read in every position. So in ruku', this is what you say. In sajda, this is what you say, number one. Or even if you're doing it with the actions, but it's not actually the salah, right? So you're going through the motions, but it's not necessarily that you're praying. You're just teaching them, right? So it's like instruction. And then sometimes you do it whilst you're actually doing the salah as well. So if you're praying with young children, and just say it's dhuhr, or even if it's maghrib, one of the loud prayers, to read out the adhkar out loud, it's something which is permissible, right? To teach, right? With the intention of teaching someone. So Umar radiallahu anhu, sometimes the dua al-istiftah, which is the first dua that you make when you begin the salah. So for example, subhanallah wa bihamdik. Sometimes in salah, in congregational salah, when he was leading the companions, he would read it out loud. And then he would say, I did it to teach people who don't know, right? Because you've always constantly got new people coming in, new Muslims, travelers, Bedouin Arabs coming in and so on. And the only time and place that they would learn is through the salah. Right? And Umar radiallahu anhu, actually, if you look at his salahs, he would do this quite often. He would leave things, or he would do things, or he would read things out loud to teach people. So it's something, inshallah, which is fine for the purposes of teaching, inshallah. But as long as they know, obviously, then that once they start reading the salah, that it's something that they should do silently. Anyone else? Okay, so number 3, right? So we did 2 places, 2 times when you make this isti'adha. Number 3 is when shaitan comes and he whispers to you about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, makes you doubt in Allah Azza wa Jal, or your worship of Allah, or your existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said in the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, which is collected in Bukhari and Muslim, he said, يأتي الشيطان أحدكم فيقول من خلق كذا من خلق كذا حتى يقول من خلق ربك من خلق ربك فإذا بلغه فليستعذ بالله ولينتهي. Right? So he said, Shaitan comes to one of you and he says to you, who created such and such? And who created such and such? Until he keeps escalating, and then he says, who created your Lord? Right? Who created your Lord? So when he does that, then say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, and stay away. So this hadith is actually a very powerful, interesting hadith. Because the Prophet ﷺ is saying to us, this is how shaitan begins. Right? Shaitan always starts off very small. The seed is always very small. And it's often something which you find acceptable. Or even if you don't find it acceptable the first time, the second, the third, the fourth time, it becomes acceptable for you. Right? So shaitan rarely goes for the kill, right? He rarely goes into shirk, from like A to Z, right? He doesn't go from 0 to 100. But what he'll do is he'll come and he'll plant the seed and it'll be very small, right? So like we have in the hadith of the narration of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, when shirk first appeared on the earth, right? In the time before Nuh alayhi salam, you had those righteous men who, when they passed away, shaitan come and said to the people, why don't you create statues in their images, just so that they will remind you of their piety and their goodness, and then you will be like them. Right? So it's a very innocent kind of excuse, right? That's how shaitan comes. And it's only once the people have bought into that concept that it starts to then escalate. Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah, in his book Talbis Iblis, The Devil's Deception, right, which we have I think in English is a summarized version that's been translated. He mentions a story that's narrated from Al-Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah. Al-Hasan al-Basri said that there was a man who once came and he heard of a